everyone, and welcome to Lifeways class. For the last couple of weeks, we have been tackling a couple of different, very important and very controversial topics. 2 weeks ago, we talked about warfare, and we looked at the mass Chalcolithic grave site at Tel Brak. And then last week we took up and we started looking at the various ways in which ancient peoples buried their dead and in which form those have taken. Now, last week what we covered was the Pythoi burials in southern through northern Mesopotamia, which is part of Syria today. And we also looked at how that tradition was also passed on to parts of the Levantine coast. We have also looked at the burials that have been left by nomads and people involved in transhumance. And we also have looked at the shaft graves as demonstrated in Jordan. And we're actually going to be looking at a type of burial that is in the same general area as those shaft graves, but were remarkably dissimilar from that. And those are burials that we often find in Canaan, or what is called the southern Levant. In Canaan, what we see principally are actually cave burials. And the soil and the way of the topography in Israel is very dominated, especially on the eastern spine of the country by these foothills and mountains. It made a lot of sense to exploit caves as a natural way to bury people. But further, we have the burials in the Judean desert. So that area from basically on a line with Jerusalem, Jericho, Qumran, so maybe even the triangle, the Dead Sea area. Now the Judean desert and the Negev desert are two totally different regions, and we will talk about the Negev region possibly if we have time. Most likely we won't. But in reviewing the cave burials, I'd like to hone in and kind of focus in a little bit further and talk about the Cave of the Warrior, or cave number 13, which was uncovered by archaeologists in 1992, 1993. And even though I have not participated on that team or been a part of it, reading about it and developing a lot of research on it has been a great passion of mine, because there are a lot of elements about this burial that still pique a lot of interest. In fact, you will find a lot of literature based on this one burial, because there are a lot of unresolved questions. Now, in the Judean desert, it is very arid, very dry, and when it gets the very little precipitation and humidity that it does, oftentimes the soil erodes and it reveals cracks and fissures and caves in the side of the hills. And these have been exploited since time immemorial. So we're going back, to Neolithic, maybe even Epipaleolithic times, in which people have found this place to be very important to bury personal objects, documents, coins, and also to use for burial. Now, the Cave of the Warrior, cave number 13 in the Judean desert, is characterized by three periods, characterized by the Neolithic, by the Chalcolithic, and the Hasmonean period. So that's the period that followed the rise, the occupation by the Greeks and the Hellenes, and came right before the Roman occupation. The Neolithic, all three have very different finds. I'll just mention real quick, the Hasmonean find was in the form of a large coin hoard, so a large gathering of coins that was stored there. But more interestingly is the Neolithic, in which it was characterized by bifacial cherts and stones which have been whittled down and worked and shaped into the form of blades, even arrowheads, which are used obviously for penetrating and killing of animals. But there are also other uses. You could use this in surgery. You can very easily cut yourself very deeply with these objects and could remove problems or could cause problems. Now, the Cave of the Warrior specifically is dated to the Chalcolithic period. The warrior himself is dated to the Chalcolithic, and that is based on diagnostic, usually carbon-14 dating. The warrior, we do know from morphological analysis of the body, is male, and this cave is very important because it is one of the very few in which we have a fully articulated skeleton. That means the skeleton is fully intact. We've got the head, we have the skull, we have the neck, the whole body is present. And one of the reasons for that presence is that the warrior was wrapped up in very costly, very expensive linens and matting material, which prohibited whatever moisture was around from getting in. Now, underneath the body were elements such as a 125 centimeter or about 49-inch length bow, and then there were 4 arrow shafts recovered. 2 of these arrow shafts were made of reed, and 2 of them were made from hard woods. The bow, very uncharacteristically for the region, was made of a hardwood, olive wood, and was dated to, again, about the early part of the Chalcolithic. Very unusually, there are 2 items that make this bow and the entire burial stand out from many of the burials in the region. Number 1, the implements, especially the bow, but also many of the personal items were stained with red ochre, which is easily done by mixing different elements together, usually some elements of dirt and water, and crushing some leaves, and it produces a red ochre color, and it will stain these objects. So that was very unusual. We don't have any other examples of stained implements in the burial in Jordan. We did see the single bow that was buried there in the shaft grave in tomb A114N, but it was, just plain wood. Also, what's very unusual and very uncharacteristic is that the bow was broken. It was ritually killed, and that again is not very common. Now, in the area in which the warrior was buried, we have a lot of burials that have remains of archery materials. We have another cave called the Cave of the Sandal, which was not too far away and had 6 arrow shafts in it. But generally, this was a very unique find because during the Chalcolithic period into the Middle Bronze Age, we see that the majority of weapons in the Canaanite region were mace heads, spears, daggers, even double-headed or the duckbill type of axe head. And so it was a very different type of burial to find. And there were some clues that may indicate that this person was subject to maybe a certain level of discrimination. One of the morphological analyses revealed that the body was not only male, but that it was also very distinct from the general area. Many of the people in the area that it was buried amongst did not fit the same morphological profile, and he could have been African. In fact, a lot of the evidence tends to support an African origin for this warrior, and not a northern Levantine or even Anatolian origin. Again, we have a high concentration of archery. Burials at Jericho, mace heads, daggers, spears, same type of implements buried there, but no archers buried at Jericho. So why was this person very uniquely buried in this region, in this location? Why were archers only buried here? And why did he have his bow broken? Breaking of bows has several meanings, and there are many articles out there that discuss at length why a bow might be broken. Many of them can be as general as just breaking the power of the bow, meaning that this person considered it a very sacred personal object, something with which they identified with, not only for their profession, but in themselves. So breaking it meant that nobody could possess it after they died, and nobody could rob them. It was going to be very unnecessary to rob the grave because that was a broken implement and you couldn't use it. But also we may want to consider that it was a part of a curse. In Hittite formulas and Hittite curse formulas, we know that there was ritual breaking or killing of arrows and the bows, and it says specifically, if I violate my oath and if I do not follow through on what I have sworn, may my arrows be broken, may my bow be broken. And it goes on to state, may I become a woman, may I dress like a woman and act like a woman. In that day and age, it was very frowned upon to be a woman, and nobody was seeking to be a woman, as everybody seems to be doing today. But anyway, so we should understand that discrimination is not something that is unique to our time period. And definitely in our world, one of the chief moral sins that anybody could commit is to discriminate against another person. However, for the larger part of the history of the world, discrimination has not only been, let's say, accepted, but it has actually been cultivated. And in many of these ancient cultures that we have studied, we see these enduring cultural institutions, religious institutions, dress, hairstyle, ways of behaving, all kinds of things continued to endure over long periods of time. And that is because these life ways that we are studying, it's not just a random choice and just to say, I like to do it this way. This was a part of their identity. This was a part of who they were. This was a part of, if I don't do this, I don't have personhood or value in my community, and much more importantly, in myself. And so in this ancient setting, there was an extreme cultural homogeny and an extreme way of defending who they were. And it was much more important to them. In today's world, you can take a little bit of this, take a little bit of that, put it all together. But in their world, in order to be a part of the community, you had to do these things. And that also extended to the afterlife. So you wanted to continue to be accepted, and you wanted to continue to be faithful to your people, even in death. And so you wanted to be buried in the same way that everybody else was. Definitely that world was defined by conformity. And so for this person to be isolated, to be basically cast out of the community, indicates that this person was definitely not a part of the greater community. And we should be investigating these things and discussing them and using them as opportunities to examine culture bias in the ancient world, but also to ask ourselves questions of, is discrimination or some levels of differences and cultural homogeny something that we would benefit from? And should we be valuing more of that in our own lives? Or do we thrive and find more meaning from having a lot of cultural differences? Well, thank you very much for attending this lesson today. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Thank you.